Hi, this is Recompile, and in this video we're going to go over some of the basics of using EcuFlash to tune your Evo. Now before we get started, it's important to understand how the Evo ECU works. The Evo ECU is a flash-based ECU in which the settings for the ECU are stored in a ROM image file. The image file has to be downloaded off of the car, edited externally, and then flashed back to the car in order for the settings to take effect. In its stock form, you can't live flash an Evo and have these settings take effect while the car is running. You have to do this while the car is turned off. Makes tuning a little bit more difficult, but there are some developments being made that will potentially allow live map tuning in the future. So first, before you get started, with EcuFlash running and your Tactrix cable connected to the car, with the ignition turned on in the on position but with the car not started, you're going to use the Read from ECU option in EcuFlash. This will take a few minutes, but it'll basically download the entire ROM image from the car and bring it into the EcuFlash window for you. I'll open up an existing ROM image so that we can mess around with one. Once you've got the ROM image downloaded from the car, the first thing you'll probably want to do is save it. You can use the Save ROM or Save ROM As feature. Basically just give it some basic name. And you can save as many of these as you need to, edit them as you go. You can keep multiple instances of your ROM, and all your settings will be stored in this file. So if you want to save your stock file, make it a read-only file and not touch it, that's the approach I've gone with. So with the file opened up, you can see on the left we have all the metadata for this ROM listed. It's categorized, and by default a lot of these options are grayed out. Now you may not have some of these options as well, depending on your version of your EcuFlash as well as any other additions you've made. So yours probably won't look identical. It'll also vary depending on what year car you have and what your ROM ID is. So basically you have to think of EcuFlash as a roadmap for your ECU. All of your settings that are stored in your ROM image file are then made accessible with EcuFlash. EcuFlash knows where things live inside your ROM image file, and it allows you to edit them by defining them in XML format and then bringing them up to user interface. So you'll notice that a lot of these things you can't do anything with. When they're grayed out, it doesn't give you the option to use them. You'll get a nice alert. Says your user level is set too low. By default, it's using a beginner user level. You can change that by going to File Options, going to the user level under Metadata, and changing it to Intermediate, Advanced, or Developer. I'll use Developer just to make sure that all of our features are accessible. You can also change other things in here, like the color scheme it's going to use for maps, but for the most part, you're going to leave this default. Now you see all of our maps are enabled here. This just gives me full access to anything that I've defined or anything that EcuFlash out of the box has defined already. Now that we've got access, basically to give you an idea of how EcuFlash is set up, let's take a look at one of the maps. One of the most basic things we can look at, a fuel map. So this is a stock fuel map on my Evo 9. And the fuel map is broken up into a few different versions, but we'll get to that in a minute. So what EcuFlash is telling us in this representation is that we have engine load on one axis and RPM on another. Engine load is effectively how much airflow is going through the engine. Up to about 100, you're looking at naturally aspirated. The turbo hasn't spooled yet. And beyond 100 is a boost, positive pressure. What the fuel map represents is how much fuel the ECU will add, depending on where you are on the RPM scale, where you are on the load scale. Now on a more basic level, before we get into the tuning aspect, understand that EcuFlash doesn't store, or I should say, the Evo ECU doesn't store these actual values as you see them in the ROM image file. It stores other numbers that represent these by way of a scaling. Now, a scaling is basically a way to make you understand visually what you're looking at without having to make sense of different numbers. So basically, our scaling, if we go into the map definition by selecting Edit Map, we can see our scaling for a fuel map is based on AFR, which is air-fuel ratio. Those are the values that are in the 3D map here. All these are AFR values. Along the x-axis we have load on the top, and on the side, on the y-axis, we have RPM. So this data is visible because EcuFlash knows what scaling to apply. If we were to change this scaling to something other than RPM, we would see an entirely different set of data. So now you can see we just get some funky values in here. And this is because EcuFlash is basically misrepresenting what the ECU has in that address. So it's important to see that if your data doesn't look correct, it could be a scaling issue, because otherwise EcuFlash doesn't know how to present this information to you. So let's just go back here, edit this map, change it back to RPM. Close this and go back in. Okay, so once we have access to a map, like a fuel map, we can do a lot of different things. We can change one cell at a time. We can increment and decrement the values in these cells, and pretty much all the options are listed under the Edit menu. So if we need to increment, we're going to use the right bracket here. Decrement, we'll use the left bracket, and so on. That's basically how you work with a table that lives in EcuFlash. You can actually edit the scalings right from here as well, in terms of editing the values that live in these scales. So if we need to set this guy to 8,000, we can hit the equals key, type in 8,000, and there you go. It's changed. Similarly, if we need to change a fuel map cell value from 14.7 to 15.7, we would do the same thing. We click the cell, hit equals, type in the value, and hit enter. You can also select multiple cells, change them all at the same time. And you can select multiple cells. Say we had these two guys and we wanted to add. We can hit the increment button on the keyboard, and it will go up. Whatever that AFR scaling has defined as an increment value is what it will go up by. So if we go back in to edit this map once again, and we look at the settings for this AFR scaling, this will bring up the increment edit is 0.1. So here is another actual way, while we're in the screen, we can see what EcuFlash has to do in order to display these values to you. So actually, if you get technical and you want to know what is living inside your ROM image file, it's a decimal value or hexadecimal value equivalent to one of these possible examples, or basically a 1 byte value between the ranges of 0 and 255. That gets converted using these formulas here in order to represent visually what your actual air-fuel ratio is. You don't really need to understand the technical aspect of how this works, but it's good to understand that what EcuFlash is doing is basically doing a bunch of conversions for you, so that the information that's stored in binary state in the ROM image is actually readable to you as a user. So now that we've taken a look at a fuel map, we can just go through and look at some of the other basic attributes that an ECU image has from the Evo. As you can see, they're broken up into categories for organizational purposes. You can see we have timing maps. On the Evo 9 we've got MyVec Cam and Take Advanced maps. We also have things like the rev limit and other things that I've added that you probably don't have, particular OBD2 inspection tables, etc. This is kind of the beauty of EcuFlash, in that the more that people discover about how the intricacies of the Evo ECU work, the more tables that can be added and defined into EcuFlash and allow you to edit more. If we look at the very top here, it's collapsed by default. If we expand the ROM info tree, you get some more information about your ROM image. In particular, one thing you should know is your internal ID for your ROM. This basically is a version control that Mitsubishi has attached to their ROMs. And there are several different types of versions. And depending on your year, your specific model, your internal ID, your ROM ID will be different. But it's good to know, because when someone is referring to a specific table address or a specific modification for an Evo ECU, they're probably going to associate with that with a specific ROM ID or a specific ROM version. And if someone has released information pertaining to the 88590015 Evo 9 ECU, it probably won't apply to you if you don't have that same ROM ID. There are a few exceptions. So you should be able to download your ROM from your car, save it. Once you've set your developer level high enough, you should be able to see all of the tables that are defined. You should be able to determine your ROM ID from the ROM info tree. And you should have quite a bit of basic information about what is living inside this ECU ROM image. Let's try to understand more exactly of what EcuFlash does. Again, as I said before, EcuFlash is a roadmap for you to understand what's in that ROM image. The way it does that is through XML files. XML files that come with EcuFlash as it's installed, and also XML files that you can edit and add to along the way. Those XML files can be edited visually within EcuFlash by going directly into the edit table, edit map definition screens. And they can also be edited manually on the file system. If you look at the tab titles at the top here, 88590015 is the XML file that this information is inherited from. And you'll also notice that any given ROM can inherit multiple XML files. So it's also inheriting Evo 9 base from 2008-1101. All you have to know to understand this is that Evo 9 base is a parent inheritance that all Evo 9 ROMs will use. So basically all Evo 9 ROMs will have these same attributes in common. So basically every high octane fuel map for an Evo 9 will be scaled to an AFR with an x-axis of load and a y-axis of RPM. You can get more granular and go into the 88590015 specific version, and it even gives you a nice description. This map definition is inherited from parent. Shaded fields indicate ones which are inherited from Evo 9 base. Only make changes to fields if they're unique to this ROM. So specifically, the 88590015 tab gives us specific address for where this table lives. And you'll notice on the Evo 9 base parent XML file, the address is left blank. This is important to understand because the address of any given table, whether it's a fuel map, a timing map, a rev limit, those addresses will change depending on your ROM ID. But what doesn't change is the schema or the structure of the table. So the idea is that EcuFlash will